at the time of this recording, War Made Invisible. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Solomon. Mr. Solomon, how you doing, sir? Welcome to the Cajun Conservative Show.
Oh, thanks a lot for inviting me.
Oh, no problem, no problem. You have a new book out. This is one of several books you have written, and I want to thank you personally for sending me a copy of it. I got it right here. Started reading it. I'm about maybe one quarter of the way through. Unfortunately, I'm not a fast reader, but very interesting book. You got some good things in here. Just want to ask you, what's the book about, and tell us a little bit about the research.
Well, really, it's about the ways that in our last few decades in this country, war has become very normal, usual, like white noise, just the wallpaper of the media echo chamber. We are so used to it, like, fish in water. After a while, what water? We get it constantly, and we're hearing less and less about it. And yet the results are really large. And so, really, it's important, I think, to take a fresh look, step back, and say, where's the money going? Why is most of the discretionary budget of the US going to the military? What's going on at home? What do we need for people in the United States? And how is it that the news media don't really tell us much about the effects of these wars?
And the effects are devastating. We just came out of the longest active war in the United States, which is Afghanistan. President Biden really did a bad job pulling out our troops out of that. But for years, we heard, weapons of mass destruction. This was saving the country of Iraq and Afghanistan. And unfortunately, as history is being told now, that Afghanistan isn't a free nation no more. It just went right back to the Taliban.
Well, as you say, we were told, for instance, with Iraq, there were weapons of mass destruction, so the United States had to attack. And that was a lie. That was intentional deception. It was mostly engineered not only by the Bush administration in general, but Vice President Cheney in particular. And part of the technique was he would find really dubious, shady sources that were really unreliable. He would pump it up. He would sell it to some journalists. And I'm talking about places like the New York Times and the Washington Post. They'd put it on the front page. Then he'd go on the network TV and say, I'm not just saying this. It's also being said by the New York Times and the Washington Post. So it was a scam. And I have to say, the war machinery of the last decades, it's been a bipartisan scam. It's been Democrats and Republicans in Washington who are more interested in satisfying the lobbyists of the military industry. And I don't really feel it's even a defense industry. Those who are making billions of dollars in profits, CEOs making enormous amounts of personal income, the shareholders of getting the rich richer. This is making a killing on war. And as I think you're referring to, we've had several thousand Americans die in Iraq. We've had many more injured. We've had many, many more come home with PTSD, what used to be called shell shock in World War I. Whatever you call it, it's really a struggle for people. And why should Americans and those who are subjected to U.S. wars and U.S. firepower, why should our lives be so distorted and sometimes destroyed? Because a lot of military contractors want to make more money, and we have politicians who are basically engaged in propaganda.
And you say propaganda. Isn't it true that majority of these wars they have a backroom agenda to it as well? You mentioned Cheney earlier, Dick Cheney, him and President Bush. And look, I didn't agree with everything with President Bush, but this is one of the things. Didn't we go to Iraq and Afghanistan basically for oil? We know because of 9/11 and everything that happened like that, but like Iraq, it wasn't Saddam Hussein that went ahead and attacked us. We all of a sudden we're declaring for war, and we're trying to protect, in their words, the oil reserves out there.
I think it's a great point because Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi government, I mean, I went there before the war as a journalist. It was a repressive regime, but it had nothing to do with 9/11. They hated Al Qaeda. out of the Iraqi government and vice versa. It was a secular government, the last thing that Al Qaeda wanted. But as you say, tremendous oil reserves in Iraq. And Cheney and his friends and Halliburton, they had maps of the oil reserves and the grade and quality of the oil in different parts of Iraq. Several years later, and I quote them in my book, high US government officials said, why do we pretend the war in Iraq wasn't about oil? It was mainly about oil. That's the kind of truth that if we had heard more early on before the invasion, maybe it could have been stopped.
And it would have saved countless lives, because you know, a war like that, and because you go back in history, and I'm a big history buff. The Revolutionary War freed this country. The Civil War brought this country back together. You had the Congress isn't supposed to declare war on a drop of a dime.
Right.
And you know, a lot of people, and I can't remember the congresswoman's name, when she voted against that, when we declared war to go into to go fight Al Qaeda, or this war on terror, as you say in your book, she said no, and people, oh, you're unpatriotic, you're being dogmatic. Why? But the one thing I do agree with her, she wanted to look at the problem, and look, war is a big deal. We should make sure all our ducks are in a row and make sure that it's saving people's lives, not hurting it.
Absolutely. I think you're referring to Barbara Lee, the
Yes,
congresswoman from
yes,
California. She had to get bodyguards after she voted no to go to war, because there was such a war hysteria whipped up. You know, when the flag is waved and the president says we've got to go fight the evildoers, and the news media are telling us that has to happen, there's a tremendous amount of momentum. And I looked at polling that I quote in the book. Right at that time, when Congresswoman Lee was the only person to vote against authorization for use of military force, first against Afghanistan, then later against Iraq, the amount of hostility towards her was mirrored in the kind of media coverage we got, whether it's the local paper in New Orleans or New York or San Francisco or anywhere else. They were for attacking Afghanistan. And it was just groupthink. It was conformity, follow the herd. It didn't matter whether someone was a high school dropout or a PhD. The chances were overwhelming. They would say, oh, we must go and attack Afghanistan. And I looked at the Gallup poll at that time, a few weeks after 9/11, when it was clear the US was planning to attack Afghanistan, but it hadn't quite started yet. It was stunning. 90% of the US public told Gallup poll that they wanted the US to attack Afghanistan. 5% said no, and 5% said they weren't sure. Well, what kind of country can whip up this enthusiasm for war that 1 out of 20 was the only number that was saying, no, we shouldn't go ahead and do that. This is mind-blowing that we have that kind of a propaganda system. And I think that this goes way behind and beyond any matter of party, Democrat, Republican. Less and less does this have anything to do with liberal, conservative, socialist, right-wing, whatever. This cuts across. You have, pardon my language, maniacs in Congress who are Republicans and who are Democrats who are bloodthirsty for war. The lobbyists are telling them that it's necessary. And oh, by the way, our stock shares are going to keep going way up. That's sort of parenthetical, but well understood, because the more weapons sold to the Pentagon and the more weapons the Pentagon provides to Ukraine, the bigger profits for the elites. I think we are looking at a tremendous crisis. Martin Luther King Jr. described it as the madness of militarism. And just like Congresswoman Barbara Lee, when Dr. King denounced the Vietnam War in 1967, and I quote him in the book, he also needed bodyguards. He was vilified. Why don't you just, the message from the news media, including the so-called liberal media and the conservative media, was, why doesn't he stay in his place? He's doing a disservice to his people. The United States must go to Vietnam. Stay in your lane, Dr. King. And of course, it turned out he was absolutely correct.
So I got a question on that, because you talked about Congresswoman Lee, talked about Martin Luther King. You mentioned him in the book. And I believe I read that the part already in the book, and I just like you to reiterate that to my audience. Do you think these big
Yeah.
shell corporations and these and the Pentagon and some in the Senate, some in the House, are they using patriotism to get money?
I think absolutely for their careers. Now, they want campaign contributions for reelections. A lot of them swing through a revolving door. They might be in the Senate or the House now, but in 5 or 10 years, they may swing out of there and go on the board of major corporations that are selling weapons to the Pentagon. There's a door that swings both ways, and often the lobbyists then run for Congress. So they have money that they know they will gain. They will get financial support and leverage if they do that. It's really a corrosive influence, and they might be quote unquote sincere, but it's hard to bite the hand that's signing your paycheck. And in a lot of instances, they may have some doubts, they may be unsure, but what tips it over, the tipping point is other people are doing it. I don't want to have my political head above the barricade. I don't want to be vilified. I don't want to be defeated in the next reelection. And the net result is we have way too many sheep in Congress who just go along. They're led by the nose, and we're suffering as a result. That's where I believe, and let me just acknowledge, I was a Bernie Sanders delegate to the Democratic National Convention. And one of the things that Bernie Sanders has done is he has transcended the left right stuff. He went to a conservative state, West Virginia, in 2016. He won every county against Hillary Clinton. He was not a warmonger, and he was saying that the elites, what he called the oligarchy, have way too much power in this country. I think we have a challenge to move ahead and say, let's call it what it is. We have huge corporations profiteering from war while the people in our own country are suffering, and the people who are being bombed and strafed in other countries, courtesy of US taxpayers, they are just as much human beings as we are. And why don't we acknowledge that?
That's why I want to ask you as well, because a lot of people might be listening to this and say, "Well, Mr. Norman, are you against the military?" I don't get that from you, but you want it to be where, look, it's justified. 'Cause I read in your book, we just didn't have a war. It wasn't just the Iraq War or the Vietnam War. Obama sent troops to Syria. Trump, in my opinion, I think was the only one that did not start a war, and he was in the process of pulling and stopping us from war because he understood that, hey, it's costing us money there. Just in Iraq alone, we left over $1 billion worth of equipment that now Al Qaeda has access to, and now we're not in Ukraine per se, but a lot of almost $1 billion or so have went to Ukraine, and we don't even have a foot soldier that I'm aware of in that nation right now.
Well, it's very lucrative. I mean, just again, selling these weapons, providing these weapons really to Ukraine, there's a lot of money. Now, a lot of money being made. Something has happened that I think is very dangerous. The word diplomacy has become a dirty word. And you have a lot of Democrats and a lot of Republicans on Capitol Hill saying, I don't want to hear about diplomacy. We have to defeat the Russians. We have to. And this is a way of saying, keep the war going, boys. Keep sending the weapons. Keep making the billions of dollars for the corporations. They don't say it that way, but that's the way it boils down. In terms of respecting the military, I respect the troops. I don't respect when a commander in chief manipulates the troops, forces them to go into a war based on lies. That's something else.
I agree with you, and like you said, it isn't a left and a right issue. You had Bush, you had Obama. Like I said, the only one, and maybe this is why they don't like Trump that much, is because of Trump saying, look, we need to get out these senseless wars. We need to stop spending money overseas. And he was trying to say America first. And these people are not necessarily saying America first. They're saying, look, we're first. And to make make us profitable, we're going to have to start these wars with people and fill our own pockets.
Well, it's an interesting point because the styles are different. A Bush or an Obama, they speak differently and so forth. In terms of Trump, his rhetoric would really vary. Sometimes in the same speech, he would say, those Democrats, they're a bunch of wimps. They don't stand up for America. You know, he threatened to make the soil of North Korea radioactive, you know. But then he also will say, the Democrats are dragging us into wars we have no right to be in, we should not be in. So, you know, if I could edit the speech, I'd say I like the part that doesn't contradict the other part. Also, in terms of Russia, there was, I think, good statements from Trump saying we shouldn't polarize with Russia. We shouldn't make more enemy relationships with Russia or China. But turning around, he funneled a lot of money to NATO. He got trashed for criticizing NATO. So then he made nice with NATO. Mm-hmm. And he, in fact, canceled a vital treaty. This is something that Trump did, unilaterally canceled the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was a great accomplishment under Reagan in the 1980s. It got rid of an entire category of medium-range missiles in Europe, Russia and the United States. And Reagan was very wise to agree to that, to sign it, to promote it. Trump killed it. So this is tremendous momentum from what Dr. King called that madness of militarism. And we, I think, have a opportunity, responsibility, and need to say, we're going to see through it because, frankly, every president in my lifetime has been good at blowing smoke about how they want peace, they don't want to have confrontation. But the military-industrial complex, and you can tell by the budget, because whether it was Bush, Obama, Trump, or Biden, they all fought to increase the military spending of the U.S. Treasury while people are going hungry in our own country.
Yeah, and the inflation is going through the roof, and we're spending more money. And see, a lot of people look at me when they hear me talk about, hey, let's stop the spending, and I'm more of a Ron Paul type of person on that part where, hey, look, hey, let's cut the budget clear across the board. And if you remember, maybe 6 months ago when Rand Paul first came out with that was one of the first things conservatives attacked him on. Oh, you want to cut the defense budget and you want to cut this and cut that. And it's funny how they always go to that to try to keep their money as well.
Yeah, and the language is really important. You know, as George Orwell said, the words don't cause us to have sloppy thoughts, but it makes it easier. And that's the word defense, because we are told, you want to cut the defense budget? Well, I wouldn't cut a defense budget if it was really for defense.
I agree with you.
That's the problem. A lot of it has nothing to do with defense, but it has a lot to do with helping some individual profiteers who are CEOs or major stockholders. It helps them buy another yacht or buy another Learjet, but that shouldn't be what our budget and priorities are about. You know, it's said that the budget is the moral document. And when it's not a moral document, then it is an immoral document. And my own belief is that we shouldn't be spending anywhere near this much money for bombers and bombs and aircraft carriers. What's wrong with feeding people? I mean, I really want to know what's the problem with that. We just had a forced debt ceiling legislation enacted that cuts food allotments for poor kids. I just don't get it.
It's more work. I know what it is. Kids are not as important as filling in the pockets, our back pockets.
Evidently, that's what the power elite say.
So before I ask you to go ahead and I tell people where they can get the book, because it did come out at the time of this recording, which is June 13th. This episode is going to come out. This interview is going to come out on our next podcast. I read in the email when we was in contact and getting ready. I want to know your thoughts on the current issues with Donald Trump. Trump is indicted. He has been indicted for the second time on federal charges, 37 counts. And it looks like it's funny how, we're talking about defense spendings and all this stuff. If you notice, one of the main regimes or what the left and socialism try to do to try to build up their military presence, then they try to start taking rights away and they get rid of their political opponents. Do you see it as this way, or what are your thoughts on this whole indictment of Donald Trump in federal charges?
Well, I think if a substantial portion of what the indictments allege is actually true, then what he did is unprecedented. any president that would take that kind of classified material and strew it all around and have it unsecured and so forth, there's just no precedent for that. I do contrast the indictment, which is 31 of the counts are for alleged violations of the Espionage Act, to an Espionage Act conviction. And I mention him in the book, a U.S. Air Force veteran named Daniel Hale, who is now in the middle of serving a 45-month sentence in Marion High Security Prison in Illinois, federal prison. He's partway through a nearly 4-year sentence because he provided classified documents to the media that showed that almost 90% in many cases of U.S. drone strikes were killing civilians. So here's somebody who has the courage to take classified documents and provide them to the press, because the American people are supposed to know. It's supposed to be the informed consent of the governed in democracy. And it's like no good deed goes unpunished. This really good deed got really punished. They threw the book at him. He violates they're told, they say, the government convinces the court that he violated the Espionage Act. He's in the slammer, and in a high security slammer at that. If he had been allowed to tell in the court why he did what he did, which is forbidden under the Espionage Act, if he was allowed to say the reason why he disclosed his information, he might have never gone to prison. Now, Donald Trump is under the same restrictions. If and when this goes to trial, and I guess it will, he also will not be allowed to say why he did what he did. In the case of the Air Force veteran, it would be called a public interest defense, that he shared the classified information in the public interest. From what I know about Donald Trump, there's no way he could make that defense. Whatever the heck he did, it wasn't for the public interest.
Now, one more question before, because you're talking about Donald Trump. Do you think this is why a lot of people, and I'm hearing in my inner circles, why a lot of people think, hey, this is a partisan witch hunt and all that? Mike Pence got cleared just a couple of weeks ago. Hey, you didn't do no criminal actions. We're not coming against you. Biden's investigation still isn't underway. They say they haven't interviewed him. They haven't done no paperwork. I think the only one thing they're looking at is, hey, did the documents get wet in the garage? You had Hillary Clinton delete 30,000 some emails. Do you see this as a tutorial justice system? How, hey, if you're part of the establishment and you go with everything we want, you're fine. You're not going to get touched. But if you're going against the system, you're out of luck.
Well, I think if we look at both the Pence and Biden situations, when they found the documents, from everything we know, they turned them over. And the real main charges against Trump is not only that he had classified documents, but there seems to be a huge amount of evidence that he scammed it. He kept the stuff, he lied, he maneuvered to not give it up, that he had no right to it. So it's not about personalities. I might like or dislike the personalities and the political persona of Biden or Pence or Trump. That's sort of irrelevant, but they're different situations. It'll come out in the wash what it really is. I think that one of our major challenges is that we have a society that is so polarized, and I don't want to be partisan about this because I fault both parties about the war machinery that they're part of. When I look at something like what's been going on in Florida and the coded language, I'm very disturbed. We've as I think people on the grassroots, we've gone beyond racism. We have a long way to go, but we've gone way beyond that. But you got a lot of code words going on here, especially most overtly from now Ron DeSantis. And again, it's not about personalities, but we want to have a society where everybody is equal under the law, and there's not a lot of rhetoric thrown around that's like coded language, because that's the past. That's not our future. Not to get corny about it, but whatever our race or gender or sexual orientation, we're all brothers and sisters. And when we forget that, or we let demagogic politicians try to play on our worst prejudices, I don't think that's a good future.
And we have to change it because we got to make that future bright for our young ones that are coming up.
Amen.
So Mr. Norman, thank you again for being on the show. It was an honor and a blessing to have this conversation with you. Again, I have the book right here. Y'all gave me an advance copy. I appreciate that. Can you let people know where they can find your book and if they have any questions or concerns, how they could get in touch with y'all?
Sure. I love to hear from people. The book is out, as you say, just a matter of a day or so. And I do have a website. It's normansolomon.com. That's NORMANSOLOMON.com. And there is a way to click and send me an email. And the book, War Made Invisible, is available through pretty much any online bookseller now, whether it's Amazon or some of the smaller non-corporate ones. And I really appreciate hearing from anybody who reads it, and I welcome any thoughts, whatever people could share with me. I certainly would appreciate.
Now, they can also find your other books on that website, correct?
Yes, that's for sure.
So, on a different note, how many books have you written so far?
Well, this is my 13th.
Oh, wow. And it came out on June 13th. What about that?
Yes, it did. And, it was a long time coming.
I got you anything in the works yet? Because, if you ever write a book, you got to get back with me.
I am so much wanting to share some thoughts about this one and hear what people have to say. So I'll have to wait and see.
Hey, we'll be waiting for you. How about that?
Okay. Hey, you got a deal.
Hey. All right, everybody. That was Mr. Norman Solomon. He is the writer of the book War Made Invisible: How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine. It is out now. Go ahead and check it out.